In part 1 of our study in Daniel chapter 11, we learned that Satan and his ministers in the church made war with Christ by polluting his holy covenant. However, in this study, we will discover that God sent Michael to deliver his elect from the captivity of Satan and sin. During part 1 of our study, we learned that the historical context of Daniel chapter 11 verse 1 is focused on the first year of Darius, that is 539 BC, when the Medes and the Persians conquered the king of Babylon in order to free the captives so that they could return to the land of Israel to reestablish the law and rebuild the temple. We also discovered that the reason Israel came into captivity is because they forsook God's holy covenant. And as a result, there was war in the church. And this war began with the princes of Persia, who represent the law. And we learned in Daniel chapter 10 that the princes of Persia withstood Daniel because Daniel confessed that Israel had transgressed God's law and forsook his holy covenant. And as a result, Daniel chapter 11 verse 2 indicates that the princes of Persia stirred up the realm of Grecia. And recall, we learned from Daniel chapter 8 that Grecia is identified with Satan, the antichrist. And he will be used of God to destroy the church in the sense that he will come into the church peaceably. And it is through peace that he will destroy many. And so once Satan, the antichrist, is given rule over the church, there is a war between the king of the south, who represents the priests and the elders and deacons in the church. They will fight against the king of the north, who represents Satan's ministers in the church. And in the process of this war, the king of the north, that is Satan's ministers, will come with flatteries which are designed to cause the church to forsake God's holy covenant. But wonderfully, we learned that God would provide a little help. And that help would come in the form of Michael, who was sent to deliver God's elect in the sense that he defeated Satan, the Antichrist, in order to free the captives of Satan and sin. And we learned in Daniel chapter 11, verse 41, that Michael was sent to help the captives of Edom, Moab, and Ammon. So let's refresh ourselves on Daniel chapter 11, verse 41. He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, and they shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, and the chief, that is the first fruits of the children of Ammon. Now remember, in part 1 of our study, we learned that that word escape is translated as the word deliver in Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, where we read that Michael would deliver his people out of a time of trouble. And we know that that time of trouble is identified with the Great Tribulation period. Moreover, we learned from Daniel chapter 10 that God sent Michael to help Daniel as he was being withstood by the princes of Persia, which we learned represents the law of God. And so it's the law of God that wars against our mind and brings us into captivity. And in this regard, when we think about Moab, Ammon, and Edom, we have to realize that they are identified with Jewish captives who were scattered into the land of Canaan after God allowed the king of Babylon to destroy the temple. We read about Ammon, Moab, and Edom in Jeremiah chapter 40, verse 11. Likewise, when all the Jews that were in Moab and among the Ammonites and in Edom, that were in all the countries, heard that the king of Babylon had left a remnant of Judah, and that he had set over them Gedaliah the son of Ahikam and the son of Shaphan, even all the Jews returned out of all places whither they were driven, and came to the land of Judah, to Gedaliah, unto Mizpah, and gathered wine and summer fruits very much. So we see that the same group of people that are mentioned in Daniel chapter 11, verse 41, are mentioned here in Jeremiah chapter 40, verse 11, to inform us that Moab, Edom, and the Ammonites represent Jews who had been scattered at a time when Israel had been conquered by the king of Babylon. But wonderfully, God promised that he would bring again the captivity. For example, in Jeremiah chapter 48, verse 46, we read about Moab being taken captive. And then in verse 47, God says, "Yet I will bring again the captivity of Moab in the latter days." Moreover, in Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 6, God says, "I will bring again the captivity of the children of Ammon." Now, we learned some time ago that whenever we read the phrase "bring again the captivity" or "return the captivity," it always refers to God's salvation, as we read in Psalm chapter 14, verse 7, and Psalm chapter 53, verse 6, to name a few. So Daniel chapter 11 is teaching us that God is going to send Michael to deliver his elect, in the sense that Michael comes to fight against Satan in order to free the captives from sin. Now we know from verses like Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 3, that God's captives were spread, or they were scattered into the four winds or the four corners of the earth. But at the end, or immediately after the Great Tribulation, God will send his angels, Michael being the chief messenger, who sends forth the gospel to gather God's elect from the four corners of the earth, that is all around the world. So let's look at a few verses to see how all of this ties together. So in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 3, we read, "The Lord thy God will turn thy captivity and have compassion upon thee, and will return and gather thee from all nations, whither the Lord thy God hath scattered thee. If any of thine be driven out unto the outmost parts of heaven, from thence will the Lord thy God gather thee, and from thence will he fetch thee." This language is very similar to what we read in Matthew chapter 24, verse 31, where God also says he's going to gather his elect from one part of heaven to the other. "And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other." So we see in verse 29 that this gathering of those who were scattered into the four corners or the four winds of the earth, or the othermost parts of the earth, occurs immediately after the Great Tribulation. That is, immediately after the 2300 days from 1994 to the year 2000 AD, when God's elect began to see the abomination of desolation so that they could leave the church. And it was at that time that Michael was sent to deliver his people. And this is precisely why Luke chapter 4, verse 18 says that Jesus came to preach deliverance to the captives. And so when we think about the captives of Edom and Moab and Ammon, we know that God will bring again the captivity immediately after the Great Tribulation by sending the gospel into the world to gather his elect. Now, the reason that they could not be delivered in the church is because the church had polluted God's covenant. They were no longer preaching the gospel. Their daily candlestick was removed to indicate that God is no longer using them to evangelize the world. Nonetheless, God said he would give us a little help so that we would not be deceived by the flatteries that are being preached in the church. Those who represent Edom, Moab, and Ammon would not fall into those gospels which teach that we can become saved by accepting Jesus, or being baptized in water, or speaking in tongues. And as we learned in our study on Lot's daughters, Moab and Ammon are identified with Lot's seed, which is akin to the seed of Abraham. Lot's daughters produced seed after obeying God's command to leave Sodom, the church, and flee to the mountains, where they produced the seed of Abraham, who represents God's elect. And so, as the gospel goes into the world, it will produce the first fruits of salvation, which Michael and his angels will gather right up to the end of the world.